When I started thinking about the topic, I realized that the concept of women's theological education has not been developed within the Arab Church and academy. The church needs to develop a theology that includes women equally with men in theological education, because women should be full participants in theological education.
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Dr. Grace El-Zoghbi-Artin, it is so great to have you with us on the podcast this morning. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So today we have you on to share your insights into topics surrounding theological education, the Middle East, and particularly women, Arab women in theological education. To kick us off in this conversation, you were born and raised in the town of Bethlehem, Palestine. And as most of our listeners know, this is a very significant place in the Christian faith, but also politically. So could you just share a bit about your personal journey with us? What was it like to grow up in Bethlehem? And in what ways, if any, has this shaped and influenced who you are today?
Thank you, Gosen, for the question. I loved growing up in Bethlehem. It's a place that I dearly love calling home. I also think it's the most beautiful place on earth. My home is actually located within a 2-minute walk from the Church of Nativity, where historically it's believed that Jesus, the Lord of Light, was born. I love reflecting on the fact that Jesus walked in our streets, that this is the very place where he proclaimed miracles, signs, and wonders, and that he is the same today. I remember growing up in Bethlehem, admiring the beautiful hills of Bethlehem, reflecting on the words of Jesus, that the Spirit of God is on him. He has anointed him to preach the good news, to set the captives free. And I think this is a place where today that is in need in so much freedom, and a place that is desperately in need to hear the good news. Growing up, it wasn't always good news for those living in Bethlehem. There was also a challenging aspect of growing up in Bethlehem. I mean, living in the West Bank, our freedom was limited. As a child, I remember how difficult it was to grow up in a torn, worn land and in the midst of intense conflict. This entailed curfews, for example, incidents of bombing, shooting. Memories of bloodshed are still vivid up to this moment. And decades later, sadly, this has not changed. We're still going through a devastating war at the moment. Yet I was brought up in a Christian home. My parents taught me to love God and walk in his ways. They encouraged me to reflect God's love in all my interactions, to pray and to walk faithfully and humbly with him. And of course, it would be easy to say that these circumstances are an opportunity to share God's love and peace with others, which at its core, I believe it is. But sometimes one feels helpless. As Christians, currently we comprise less than 1% of the population. So it's important that we find a voice. And also it's important that we ask God to use us to pave a way for healing, and also to help others as they seek to rise out of the ashes, really. It's not easy to be a Christian in the midst of all that is going, but God gives us grace, he gives us strength. And as Christians, we're never promised with an easy life, but our attitudes should always be Christ-like, and also to look for ways to promote for peace and reconciliation. Today, I believe that I'm stronger and I'm more mature in my faith and trust in God because of the difficult experiences of growing up in a place like Bethlehem.
Well, Grace, thank you for sharing that. I had a privilege of going to the Middle East a few years ago, and I was able to visit in Bethlehem. And one of my favorite memories was actually in Bethlehem, walking in the streets at night and interacting with those who live there. And so I hope that we can circle back to your experience in Palestine. But before we do that, I'd love for our listeners to hear more about your heart passion, which is theological education in the Middle East. Now, what initially inspired you to pursue theological education? It's definitely a calling. And what has kept you motivated to complete your PhD?
Just to say, Jason, you're always welcome to Bethlehem, and our other listeners and viewers too. People are hospitable, and it's great to have visitors from all around the globe to this very special and unique place. With regards to my calling in theological education, I remember God's calling on my life when I was 13 years old, and I remember responding to this call. At the age of 13, I told God I wanted to give him my very best. I remember that I thought particularly of Paul's words that I consider everything else as a waste for the sake of knowing Christ. and knowing him intimately. So, following completion of high school with outstanding results and contrary to what many recommended, I chose to devote myself to studying the living Word of God. I saw this as a worthy vocation, calling to pursue God's greatest purposes for my life. Yet, at the same time, I was cognizant of the difficult context that I grew up in and the need for followers of Christ in that particular place. Reflecting on my own experience in theological education, I believe I chose to study this field because I strongly felt God called me into it. And throughout my years of study, I also received the encouragement of my family, my parents, my brothers, my husband, but also professionally from my lecturers who encouraged me to pursue this path. And that really made a difference in my life. What kept me motivated throughout this journey is the passion that I have for theological education, particularly in my region in the Middle East. And of course, earlier on, I realized as well that there was a scarcity of Arab women in theological education. So my first-hand experience as a theological educator involved in training women and men is what drew me to this work. I first surveyed the landscape of theological education in Palestine. I was then led to dialogue with my counterparts in other parts of the Middle East, in Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon.
Wow, I think it's so amazing that as a 13-year-old, you were able to come to a place of dedicating your life to the Lord. As we consider reaching the next generation, I just think that's such a fascinating thing for a 13-year-old. Before we move forward, I would love to hear, what was it that you feel formed you in such a way that enabled you as a 13-year-old to be able to make that decision to dedicate your life to the Lord? Were there anything in particular that you believe was impactful?
Yes, I believe my own upbringing, my family really invested in us spiritually and took every care to encourage us to walk in God's fold. And I'm very grateful, particularly for my parents and the way that they cared for us, sacrificed for us, and reminded us that everything else is a waste. It's the knowledge of God that what matters. But I was also impacted as a child growing up by the Egyptian context. I was aware of the persecution that the Egyptian church endured, but also the truth of that. And I remember when I was 13, I was listening to a worship song by one of the Egyptian worship leaders, and the song emphasized on the depth that we need to have in our relationship with God. And yeah, that really just spoke to me in a significant way. But again, reading God's word and seeing the need, particular in my own context, but also seeing the potential. Yeah, I believe that when God calls us, He equips us, and that's what He did for me. So that was it.
No, that's really challenging for me as a father of two daughters. I'm trying to figure out how I can raise them in such a way that that can be their reality, that they can come to know Christ at such a young age and dedicate their lives to them. And so, thank you for sharing that. Well done to your parents for doing all that. So,
Yeah.
so could you provide us with a little bit more information about the focus of your PhD? Why did you choose to focus your academic research on Arab women in theological education?
I really enjoyed working on my PhD. It was a challenging experience, but I was so grateful to the Lord for enabling me to pursue a higher degree. The focus of my PhD offers a contribution to the wider study of theological education through exploring the theological education of Arab Protestant women in the Middle East. So it combines historical and qualitative research to present an account of Arab Protestant women in theological education, and clearly that's a significantly under-researched field of study. And when I consider the Middle East, I know it's a deeply historic and complex context, even when we think of the ecclesial character of Christianity in the region. And often ecclesiology is rarely given consideration in modern history of Protestantism, in particular in the Middle East. But in my thesis, I sought to explore the context of dialogue with the Eastern Christian traditions as a Protestant, but also I looked at what's going on within Muslim circles by way of focusing on the women's mosque movement. My research on women posited that within this ecclesial context, within this context of Protestant presence and mission in the Middle East, that there is a need to develop ideas of Protestant ecclesiology, but also to encourage women make a contribution to theological education, that their voices would be heard within the church and the academy, that their God-given skills and talent and gifts would be of benefit to the theological academy in the Middle East and beyond. Of course, the historical and contemporary context meant that Arab women have not been able to make that contribution which they naturally aspire. But now I believe we are at an ecclesial turning point. And it's important to resource women to make a contribution to theology within this distinct ecclesial context. When I started thinking about the topic, I realized that the concept of women's theological education has not been developed within the Arab church and academy. I think the Arab world's patriarchal confines require a culturally specific outworking of the theology of theological education that addresses women's roles. The church needs to develop a theology that includes women equally with men in theological education because women should be full participants in theological education. And of course, this would only materialize when we have the hearts, minds, and lives of dedicated women of God, but also supported by men of God in the face of the land cultural constraints. I personally believe that the church and the academy cannot be successful without investing intentionally in the spiritual, biblical, and theological lives of Arab women.
Thanks for that, Grace. I'd be curious. It's, just throwing this question out there. You can answer it if you like or not. But you've had the opportunity to experience theological education outside of the Middle East. You've had exposure to a global audience and you've been able to travel. What do you believe is the difference between Arab women in the Middle East and their theological education compared to that of other spaces and places that you've been exposed to in terms of Protestant theological education?
That's interesting to reflect on. So my first context was in the Middle East, but my second context is the international context that I've participated in. As an emerging Arab scholar, my own formation in both Arab and Western seminaries has helped me to find my voice. My experiences in theological education allow me to be in a position where I can both straddle the East and the West and their complexities, advantages, and disadvantages, and to bring my experiences of this tension together with my research in order to benefit Arab women. But when I consider what's available for Western women, for example, it's a lot more than what's possible for Arab women because there are so many resources, there's a structure, and perhaps more freedom. I talked to about 50 Arab women in theological education, and it was mind blowing to listen to their stories and experiences and the potential that they have. But there is a lack of intentional focus in investing in their lives. And of course, I find that very sad. So I hope that this will change in times to come.
So, how do you go about communicating the importance and the relevance of this to those both within and without the Middle Eastern context?
So I think part of my endeavor is to think theologically about the historically deep and rich and complex ecclesial setting in the Middle East today. And one of the questions that I've been reflecting on is how Arab women might reimagine and re-engage in theological education. And, there is a whole lot of significance there. So I seek to offer the insights to others based on my work with Arab women and my findings as well, recognizing that this position of asking questions is part of my endeavor and calling. So it's a continued journey. I believe that my work and research strengthens my desire to see Arab women acknowledged in the theological academy and their potential to contribute theologically reached. Their contribution will enable them to be included in the wider theological scenario, like their experiences of persecution and suffering, but also how God is using them in their different contexts. Their voice is distinct, it's different, it's needed, it's important for the church. And this will give them a space to disseminate to others the theoretical and practical knowledge that they have learned in their own space and place.
I like how you reframed that whole conversation to be a reimagining their role within that space. How do you see, let's talk about the reimagination of this. How do you see the role of women evolving in theological academia within the broader church community within the Middle East?
So much that they can contribute to. It's important to encourage them to think for themselves, to write, to take part in conferences, workshops, trainings, sessions, to be authors. One of my surprises in my research is that when I was looking at the religious education of Muslim women, there was a lot written on that by Muslim women, on Muslim women. But, I felt that it's quite a gap in our own theological context in the Middle East. So there's a lot, faculty. Think of all the seminaries in the Middle East and how many female faculty are teaching, for example, is, serving in different capacities within the church. So there is definitely so much that they can do within that.
Why is it that there are far more books written by Muslim women than by Christian women within the Middle Eastern context? Is there a reason for that? I mean, obviously it's speculation, but I'd be interested to hear from you.
Yes, I think historically there has been a revival within Islamic context, and this has stimulated women to be active participants. It has given them agency to write and to think and to give examples of how they can live their faith in a day-to-day context. There has been so much intentional thinking. I know the stereotype often about Muslim women is that they are deficient in knowledge but in reality, there is so much that has been actually written within that context. And I think, it spurs me to see it. I really want to see more Arab Christian women rise and take their place and present whatever God has given them and enabled them to do.
I really hope that that becomes a reality. It's obviously that there's a big gap between where the church is and where it needs to be. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your doctoral research. What are some insights that you believe from your research that would really add value to this conversation, add value to those who are listening? Maybe insights that you feel would make an impact for those hearing. What do you believe your research has brought to the conversation, and what impact do you hope it'll have on the local church and the wider community?
There are so many insights, and there continues. I love just being continually engaged in this research. Yes, I have finished my degree, but my research is ongoing. And I think some of the key insights that the church needs to be aware of is that women have played an important part in the church since its inception. This is not a new phenomenon. There are many well-known men throughout church history, but also Christian women have made respected intellectual, diaconal, and evangelical contributions to the church. And these women have had a meaningful spiritual impact and authority. So throughout my research, I looked at some of these women, starting from the desert mothers. We often hear about the desert fathers. No one speaks about the desert mothers, for example. Some achieved sainthood and received titles of highest honor. Within the Eastern Christian Church, we think of women like Tekla and Helena and Nina, who was missionary to the Jordans. So it's important to explore their contributions. At the moment, these explorations are limited by a lack of resources because perhaps that few documents only from that time were written by women, but also I don't think there is sufficient interest. So it's important to encourage women to do research on such matters. But also, I think when we think now of women, the church needs to encourage women to put their thoughts into writing for the sake of future theology. Sometimes we only think of the present. What about the future? It's important to include women's perspectives, and this will enrich the church beyond traditional ways of thinking. So I feel like these insights from my research make a contribution to the development of Protestant thought in relation to other Protestant women, even as we think ecumenically. What does it mean for Protestant women to partner with other women from other ecclesial traditions? So I think through this research, I've become more aware of the importance of church history. And if one has an ecumenical intention, one has to be cognizant of the fact that the Middle East has its own culture around questions of ecclesiology. So it's important to describe the power of description, to describe both the historical realities, but also current relations between different Christian communities in the Middle East. And that's all essential for the flourishing of theological education. When I think of theological education, I think of the parable that Jesus shared. And I love that parable, like a woman who took yeast and mixed it into about 60 pounds of flour, and it all worked through the dough. And, it only starts with one person, and then surely there's the ripple effect for the church and for the communities and academy as well.
I love that parable. I think that it's really profound, and I think it's apt for the conversation that we're having today. So before we shift our conversation to speak more into the Middle Eastern Christianity, I would like to take a moment just to stop and to ask you for your advice, right? So we have a broad range of people who are listening to this podcast. Let's begin with the women that are listening in. What advice would you give to those who are listening, the ladies who are listening to this conversation, when you think about all the studies that you've done and they're saying, like, what if you had to sit down with a group of women, what would you say to them?
I would really encourage all women to, first of all, acknowledge God's call on their life and to seek for themselves what God is calling them to do. But also not to be hesitant or afraid or not to shy away from God's calling. It's important that we know that God is able to use all of us in his kingdom. There are so many biblical women in the Old Testament and New Testament who have fulfilled God's call on their lives. But even as they remain deeply rooted in their own local culture at the moment, thinking of Arab women in particular. They have a missionary role within their church. And there's a message for every woman that they do have a voice. Sometimes the default missiology seems to focus on the role of men, but women's perspective and ability to think strategically in mission work would enrich the understanding and practices of theological education. Whereas historically they haven't been invited to assume visible leadership roles, and that's important because every woman is capable. And I see this as crafting a new role for them, which is pioneering and exciting in that sense. So it's important to listen to God's voice, to acknowledge God's calling on their lives, to obey God's calling wholeheartedly, and not to be afraid, because God has given us so much, and we really should follow His call and obey Him wholeheartedly.
And what about for those male leaders who are running organizations, running churches, and they're listening to this conversation and they're saying, yes, like, I'm with you. I want this to be a reality within my organization, within my church. What next steps would you suggest that they take in terms of empowering women within their context?
So as for those leaders, perhaps who are part of the theological academy or the church, I think it's important for the church to nurture and promote a flourishing vision for women's education. So they have to think about it. They have to spend time reflecting and praying what God has for their particular context, for their particular space. How can they make space theologically and in practice for women in theological education? We are all in need of an institutional and a spiritual renewal, a revival, a new renaissance. And, that's one aspect that I focused on in my research. At the same time, I acknowledge that gender dynamics are complex in patriarchal settings, but intentional support for women's education from a male figure can really aid this paradigm shift. And I've experienced this myself. Women can offer valuable insights as they dialogue more effectively with a society that's underrepresented by Christians. Think of the minority status of Christians in the Middle East. But it's important for the church to accept and make space for gifted and qualified women. And this really strengthens my passion in a variety of ways, I hope. And my sincere desire is to be part of the creation of a new generation of female Arab theologians across diverse theological landscape, where up to this point, their presence has been underrepresented, their voices ignored, and their contributions and acknowledged. And there are practical steps. For example, for theological institutions, they could hire female faculty, give them space to think, research, implement curricular revision, include in the revision and the curricular revision courses about women's history, their writings, their perspectives. If you look at any bibliography in the syllabi, it's all written by men. It's great that there are so many men, who are so productive in theology, but women also have a voice. It's important to also provide female students, for example, with a step-by-step mentoring track, and provide them with scholarship as well. So I think that all helps.
Finally, before we shift conversation, what resources would you recommend from women in theological education that you believe could really add value to those who are listening? Anything that you would like to promote before we move on?
Yes, absolutely. When I think of the Middle East, there are some amazing women like Dr. Rima Nasrallah from the New East School of Theology, Dr. Anne Zaki from the Evangelical Theological Seminary, Dr. Najla Qassab. And many of these women have written on several issues connected to the church and so on. And I can provide you with a bibliography later on. I've actually compiled some of their resources in an article, and I'll be happy to share that with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes for those who are listening and who are interested. So one of your passions is theological education within the Middle East. So let's dive in there. Let's talk about it in a more broad sense. In your view, what is the current state of theological education within the Middle Eastern context? And what are some significant challenges? And what key contributions do you believe that the Middle Eastern seminaries have to offer the global church?
I love thinking about the topic of theological education. Although at the moment, theological education in our Middle Eastern context faces many challenges, however, we can benefit from these challenges to shift our approach to theological teaching. So sometimes students come with the assumption that formation is only for the service of the church. But I think it's important to go beyond that. It's important for students to acknowledge that they are being trained for the transformation of society. And think of the context and the landscape of the Middle East. Every country has its unique challenges. So, this is an opportunity for students to rise and to move from, if I were to call it a survivor mode, perhaps feeling like a minority, to a stronger sense of belonging within society and within the communities around them. It's important to adopt maybe a more positive attitude towards broader communities, to have partnerships, to reach out to the other. I think at the core of it, theological education is about loving God with all our hearts, minds, and souls, but also loving our neighbors as ourselves. And who is our neighbor? That takes on a whole new perspective as we seek to answer that question. Also, I think that theological education at the moment is seeking to catch up to the global church growth, including in the Middle East and North Africa. It's important to integrate theological education programs to reduce fragmentation. And from my experience, I've seen that the Lord has led some seminaries to focus on contextual reality, to equip the church to respond to the needs of the communities. But also, there are other seminaries who have sought to engage with the historical churches in the national context. So that's perhaps some of the challenges that can be transformed into opportunities. Another emerging aspect within theological education now is the incorporation of non-formal theological education, perhaps the less structured. So it's important also to focus on these and see how they can serve certain sectors within the society. Perhaps when we think of the refugees, or maybe some women in places like rural Upper Egypt or so on, they might want to be theologically educated but can't get into the seminary or the traditional theological education program. Also, aspects of formation, character and spiritual formation need careful evaluation within the MENA context. So it's important to learn more about this context that our faith inhabits us or trains us to inhabit and to live. It's important to have relationships and dialogue with other. Again, I think of another parable of Jesus about the kingdom of God being like a pearl. You sell everything. There are challenges, there are so many obstacles, but we have to keep our eyes focused on this pearl. Again, thinking of Islam and how it shapes our culture, this could be a challenge, but also that's another opportunity. Thinking of learners from Muslim background believers and how they also contribute in their own way to theological education and to the flourishing of theological education in the MENA.
One of the things that I love about hosting this podcast is being able to connect with people from all over the world. And I've just grown in my appreciation of the interconnected reality of the church, that the local church has impact and brings contribution to the global body of Christ. So I'd love to just unpack that a little bit with you in terms of the Middle Eastern church. What role do you believe the Middle Eastern church has to play within the global church? What contributions do you believe that they have to bring to the table in terms of coming together with the global church? And in a similar vein, what role do you believe the global church has to play within the Middle Eastern context?
I think, to begin with, there are certain understandings that assume whoever is from the Arab context must be Muslim. When we hear the words Arab or Arabic, it's often synonymous with Muslim or Islamic. And that's not the case, because when we associate it this way, this alienates the church from its Arab context and puts it in a different location in the West. But this is not correct, because the church and theological education has started in the Middle East. And that's one thing I think that the global church needs to be aware of, or when we think of the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. But also, there were established schools for theological education in places like Alexandria, Egypt, in the 2nd century, in Turkey in the 4th century, and so on. So it's important to keep this heritage and not to omit it, because I think this gives a fake understanding, or a false understanding, rather, of the history of theological education. That it started maybe with Western missions. And of course, we're grateful for the role that Western missions played in the 19th century, but it's important to go back to the roots and to see how this opens up new opportunities for the global church today. But I think it's important also for the global church to realize that the church in the Middle East is a persecuted church. Life can be so easy in the West. I know there are different challenges, but it's important to come alongside the church, to pray for the church, to visit the church, to see what life is like, what daily realities shape the lives of Christians, and how can both churches in the West partner with churches in the East, but also in other parts of the world.
What do you wish the global church better understood about the current realities within the Middle East?
I wish they really understood what's it like to be a Christian and how difficult that is. And some of the struggles that people have to identify and cope with on a day-to-day basis. Just think of Palestine, for example, the limited freedom that Christians have. At this moment, I think of Easter and people not being able, for example, to go to Jerusalem to worship. From a place like Bethlehem, it's just 5 kilometers down the road, and that's incomprehensible. People have freedom of worship in other parts of the world. But again, think of other realities, like how people sometimes have to give up everything they have to follow Jesus. If they come from a different background, they have to give up their jobs, sometimes their families. So there are some really harsh realities that I think that the global church needs to be aware of.
Grace, this has been such a great conversation, but we're going to have to start bringing the conversation to a close. Before we do that, I would love to just hear from you. Throughout your journey, both professional and personal, how has your faith been challenged and deepened? And how do you see the work, your work, as part of God's larger story of redemption and reconciliation in the world?
One thing that encourages me is that peacemaking is possible. And, the peacemaking initiative that I've been involved in include the way I teach my students to emphasize the message of Christ, the way that I relate to people, encouraging them in their pain and suffering emotionally, but also practically, because I've been through that. I'm an insider. I know what it feels like and what it is like to be a follower of Christ in the Middle East. Also, I think it's important in a context of suffering to be reminded of Jesus' words. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are called the children of God. Now, we live in a context where there are three religions represented: Muslims, Jews, and Christians. We all need peace, and it only comes from the Prince of Peace. So it's important to, as we think of the broader image, to keep our eyes focused on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, but also to know that we have to pray. We have a responsibility to intercede for our people. And this encourages me as I consider the larger story of redemption and reconciliation in the Word. God reconciled us to Himself through Jesus Christ, and we have to walk in His footsteps. And what better place to do that than the Middle East, I think.
Looking ahead, as you look into the future, what are some key initiatives or projects that you're excited about? And also, just add to that question, I'm sure there are going to be people who are listening in who have been inspired by something that you've said. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, looking ahead, it's important to look ahead. And I've said at the beginning, perhaps sometimes one feels helpless or hopeless, and I've been listening to these the feelings of hopelessness by so many people. But I believe that the Middle East is at an important moment at the moment. As men and women try to fight for their rights and freedoms, it's important to be reminded that as members of their first Christian communities, as we continue this legacy from the very first century, it's important to continue to articulate our faith, to share our stories, to share our narratives. It's important to make others aware of our challenges, but at the same time of our aspirations, of our dreams. A dream for a better future for the Middle East. And, at the moment, it breaks my heart what's going on in my own context, in my own country. But I believe there is hope. And surely, as Christians, we should believe theologically that hope will come out of these terrible circumstances. This is the land where Christianity was birthed. Although the numbers of Christians are currently dwindling, but there are some people who are committed and who are called to do God's work. And I believe God wastes absolutely nothing. The gospel will continue to be proclaimed. And this is our hope, really. I have hope also that God will use many women of God in the Middle East to be peacemakers and to bring about reconciliation in a much needed place and in an aching region.
Well, Grace, with that final word and message of hope and passion and desire, why don't we close off today's interview? Any final thoughts that you would like to leave with our listeners?
Final thought, I would just really like to thank all those who are listening to us and really encourage them to take this seriously. As Christians, we cannot just be onlookers. We cannot stand there and follow and observe. We have to move into action. God calls us to move into action. And I pray that God will connect to each of the listeners and viewers that they will really ask God and come to the point and say, Lord, how do you want me to help? We are all brothers and sisters, and we're one body, and when one part is aching, surely the whole body is. And at this time, there is so much aching, so much pain, so much suffering. But let's pray that although weeping endures for a night, joy comes in the morning.
Grace, this has been such a rich conversation. Thank you for taking the time to share a bit of your context with us, share some of your academic research with us, and your hopes and your dreams for Middle Eastern theological education. It's been wonderful to have you on the podcast. Thank you.